At the divorce hearing, my husband was full of arrogance. "You'll never touch my money again." His mistress smiled. "She doesn't deserve a single dime." The judge opened my letter, skimmed it, then burst out laughing. He quietly said, "Oh, this is good." Their faces went pale with fear. I want to tell this in order, because the order is the entire point. If you jump to the courtroom, it sounds like I was clever. I wasn't clever. I was a bookkeeper who never threw away a piece of paper in her life. Married to a man who was in such a hurry that he never once looked back at what he'd signed. There was no plan. I need to say that up front, because people hear the ending and assume I spent 6 years building a trap. I didn't. I spent 6 years covering the electric bill and reconciling accounts at a kitchen table and believing a version of my life that turned out not to exist. The trap built itself. All I did was keep the receipts. I was 39 at that hearing. He was 41. We had been married 15 years, and for 11 of them, I could not have told you what our marriage was worth in dollars because it never once occurred to me to ask. That's not a virtue. That's the thing I'd take back if I could take back one thing, but I can't, so instead I'll tell you what happened. I met him at a wedding neither of us wanted to attend. I was 24, 3 years into a bookkeeping job at a medical billing office, the kind of job where you learn very early that nobody lies as clearly as a spreadsheet does. He was 26 and had opinions about everything, and the opinions were mostly right, which was annoying. He told me about the company on our second date before he told me where he was from. It didn't exist yet. It was an idea about scheduling software for small clinics, and he explained it to me for 40 minutes with a pen on a paper placemat, and I remember thinking that nobody had ever been that excited in front of me before. We married 2 years later at the courthouse because the money went into the business. I wore a dress I already owned. My mother cried in a way I chose to interpret as happy. The company started in the second bedroom of a rental we could barely cover. He had a laptop, a desk from a curb, and a whiteboard he'd rescued from an office that went under. I had a salary of $41,000 and a car with a rust hole in the floorboard that let in rain. The arrangement was never written down. It was said out loud, though, hundreds of times, at that kitchen table at 11 and 12 at night, with the cheap coffee maker gurgling behind us. "You keep the lights on," he'd say. "I'll build the thing. And one day, this isn't going to be my company, it's going to be ours." I believed it the way you believe the floor is going to be there when you put your foot down. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. I was not gathering evidence. I was not hedging. I was not a woman quietly protecting herself. I was a woman completely, stupidly, gloriously in love with a man who talked about the future in the plural. Every single document that ended up mattering, I saved for boring reasons. Because I was a bookkeeper. Because our first apartment flooded in the spring of the second year, and I lost a shoebox of paperwork and swore never again. Because I bought a plastic bin with a snap lid at a hardware store for $11 and put it under the stairs. That's it. That's the whole origin of the thing that ended him. An $11 bin and a flood. The first 4 years were worse than people think when I describe them, because I describe them the way you describe weather. Here is what it actually looked like. I worked 40 hours at the billing office and then came home and did the company's books until midnight, unpaid, because a bookkeeper was a line item we couldn't afford. I learned payroll tax deposits at that kitchen table. I learned what a quarterly filing penalty feels like when it lands on a household that has $400 in checking. Twice I made payroll, not helped with, made. The first time was a March. An investor who had verbally committed went quiet, and there were 3 developers who had rent due, and my husband sat on the floor of the second bedroom with his back against the wall and said the sentence I had never heard him say, which was that he thought he should stop. I transferred $28,000 out of my savings that afternoon. That was everything I had, including money my grandmother had left me, which I had been keeping for a down payment on a house that at that point existed only as a shape in my head. The second time was smaller and worse, because by then I knew exactly what I was doing. I opened a credit card in my own name for the company's server costs. I let my professional certification lapse because the exam fees were $460 and the company needed a domain renewal and a merchant account. I skipped my 10-year reunion. We did not take a vacation for 6 years, and I don't mean we took cheap ones, I mean we took none. My mother said something to me exactly once. We were doing dishes at her house at Thanksgiving, and she said, without turning around, that I should make sure my name was on something. I laughed at her. I actually laughed. I told her that was a thing people said about other people's marriages. She dried her hands and said fine, and never brought it up again, and 11 years later, she never once said she'd told me so, which is the single most generous thing anyone has ever done for me. I kept every receipt from those years, not because I suspected anything, because when you are that poor, receipts are the only proof that the money went somewhere real. When you are counting in tens of dollars, paper is comfort. I filed them by year, I labeled them in pencil, I put them in the bin under the stairs, and then I put the next year on top, and the next, and the next, and by the time it mattered, there were 14 years in there, compressed under their own weight like something geological. Year 5, the certified letter came. A supplier we'd contracted for hardware integration claimed breach and wanted damages that had a number in them. I had to read 3 times. It was not a nuisance suit. Their lawyers were real, and their filing was thorough, and our lawyer, when we finally hired one, did not do the thing lawyers do where they tell you it'll be fine. He said it could go either way, and that if it went the wrong way, they would collect, meaning the company, meaning the house we had just barely bought, meaning the savings account, which by then had climbed back to $4,000 and change. My husband did not sleep for a week. I know because I didn't either, and we took shifts pretending to. The advice came out of a Thursday meeting I wasn't at. He called me from the parking garage, and I could hear the echo. Then he drove home and sat in the driveway with the engine running and told me before he even came inside. He says, get my name off the assets. I asked what that meant. Everything goes to you. Shares, the house, the accounts. If they win a judgment against me personally, there's nothing standing there with my name on on it. I remember exactly where I was standing, which was in the doorway with a dish towel. And I remember that my first reaction was not greed and was not suspicion. It was that it felt like bad luck, like signing something you shouldn't say out loud. I asked him if that was allowed. He said his lawyer wouldn't have suggested it if it wasn't, which was not an answer. And I knew it was not an answer. And I let it go anyway because he looked like a man who had not slept in 6 days. I asked him one more question. I asked what happens after. After it clears, we flip it back. Same afternoon. It's a formality. That is the sentence. That right there. If you remember one thing from the first half of this, remember that he was the one who said it in a driveway with the engine running to a woman holding a dish towel. We signed on a Tuesday afternoon at his office because there was a notary on staff and it was free. The office was 4 rooms above a physical therapy clinic, 14 employees. There was a foosball table nobody used and a printer that jammed if you looked at it. The notary was the girl from the front desk. She was 19. She had been there maybe 5 months and she was still at the stage of a first real job where you take everything extremely seriously, which I liked about her at the time. She had a lanyard with her name on it and chipped polish and handwriting that was neater than anyone's in that building. She had gotten her commission the year before because the office manager suggested it, and it came with a small raise. She told me that while she was setting out the stamp, in the way you tell a stranger something to fill a silence, she was careful. That's the part that comes back to me now. She checked both our licenses and held mine at an angle to the light. She had us sign in front of her, not before. She recorded it in her journal, a bound book with a red cover, 1 line per document, our names and the date and the type of instrument, and she had us initial next to the entry. She stamped every page, shares, deed, both accounts. Her seal came down slightly crooked on the 3rd page, and she apologized and did it again on a fresh copy, which took another 20 minutes, and my husband checked his phone the entire time. At the end, she asked if we wanted copies. He said, "Don't bother, we'll have the originals." I said yes. I want to be clear that I did not say yes because I was suspicious. I said yes because I have never in my life been offered a copy of a document and said no. She ran them on the printer that jammed, and it jammed, and she fixed it herself with a pen, and she handed me a warm stack of paper and said, "Have a good day." That night, they went into the bin with everything else, filed under the year in pencil. On the way to the car, he was in a great mood. The relief had hit him. He put his arm around me in the parking lot and laughed and said the thing that I would eventually hear a judge read out loud. "It's just paper. We'll flip it back when it's clean." The suit settled that winter for an amount our insurance mostly covered. It was an anticlimax. There was no verdict and no drama, just a call from the lawyer and then a dinner where we drank a bottle of wine that cost $14 and felt expensive. I brought up flipping it back twice. The first time was maybe 3 weeks after the settlement. I said we should call the lawyer and put things back the way they were. He said sure. After the quarter closed. The quarter closed. Nothing happened. The second time was that summer in the car. I said it more directly. I said I didn't like having his company in my name. And he gave me an answer I did not think about again for 6 years. Why touch it? It's working. I asked him what working meant. He said something about how the structure was clean now, and the accountant liked it, and there was no reason to pay legal fees to undo something that wasn't hurting anyone. He said it the way he said everything by then, which was quickly, while merging. I let it go. I let it go because it was July, and the air conditioning was finally working in that car, and because I did not want to be a person who nagged her husband about paperwork. I let it go because in my head, the arrangement was the same arrangement we'd made at the kitchen table. Whose name was on it did not mean anything because it was ours. That's the sentence I'd want carved somewhere if I were being funny about it. That the paperwork could not possibly matter because all of it was ours. The first real contract came the following spring. A regional clinic group, 41 locations. He phoned me from the car and could not get the words out in order. We celebrated at a chain restaurant with a coupon. I did the books that night at the kitchen table at 11 because we still couldn't afford a bookkeeper. And I remember looking at the receivables column and feeling something I can only describe as vertigo. Then the second contract came, then a third, then a warehouse and a real office and a person whose entire job was answering the phone. And that was the last year I recognized him. Nobody tells you that watching someone succeed can feel like watching them leave. It was not a single moment. It was an accumulation, and it happened over roughly 18 months. And if you'd asked me at any point during those 18 months whether my marriage was in trouble, I would have said no, and meant it. He stopped asking about my day. That was first. Not rudely, he just stopped. The way you stop watching a show. Then the language changed. It went from the company to my company, and he said it easily. At dinners, in front of people, in front of me. He'd say it the way you say your own last name, with no awareness that it was a claim at all. He hired people to do things I had been doing for free for 5 years. A controller, then a director of finance with a staff of 3. I did not resent that. That was the plan. That was, in fact, the entire point of the plan. What I resented, eventually, was that he hired all of that help at the office and none of it at home. And somehow the house and the bills and his mother's birthday and the dentist and the insurance renewals stayed exactly where they had always been, which was on me, a person who also had a full-time job. Then came the dinner. It was a partner event at a restaurant with cloth napkins. Someone at the table asked how he'd gotten through the early years, and he told the story, and it was a good story, and he told it well. He said he'd bootstrapped it. He said there were a couple of years where he was living on nothing. He said he'd bet everything he had. He did not say I was there. Not once. Not as a footnote, not as a joke, not as the woman sitting 11 inches to his left with a glass of ice water in her hand. And here's the part I've had to sit with. Nobody at that table noticed. Why would they? He wasn't lying exactly. He'd just told the story so many times that the version with me in it had worn away. And what was left was the version that made him a hero. And he had come to believe it the way you come to believe relieve a memory you've rehearsed. I didn't say anything in the car. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I would bring it up when things calmed down. They never calmed down. That was the trick. They were never going to. The girl from the front desk was not a girl anymore. She had been promoted twice in 14 months, to office manager and then to something with the word operations in it, and she was good at the job. I want to be fair here, because being unfair would be easier and less true. She was competent and she worked hard and people liked her. She also started answering his phone after 10 at night. I noticed the way you notice a draft in a house. First you're cold and you don't know why. Then you're standing in a hallway with your hand out. The calls he took in the garage. The phone turned face down on the counter, which it had never been in 15 years, because we were not people who did that. A new passcode. Then a second new passcode a month later. A charge on the card for a hotel in a city where the conference he'd mentioned had ended 2 days earlier. That one I looked at for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and went and folded laundry, because I was not ready. And I want to be honest about that too. He'd come home and I'd ask an ordinary question and he'd answer it in a slightly wrong register, a half second too fast. And I would think, that's the sound of a man who rehearsed on the drive. I did not confront him. People always want to know why, and the answer is not strategy. The answer is that I was 48 hours away from a certainty I did not want, and I kept choosing the 48 hours. What I did instead was small and boring, and it turned out to be the only useful thing I did in that entire year. I started printing statements again, not because I thought I'd need them, because printing statements is what I do when I'm frightened. It's the only form of error I've got. He filed on a Tuesday in March. I was served at my desk at work, which he could have prevented with one phone call and did not. A man came to the front and asked for me by my full name, and the receptionist walked him back, and everyone in a room of 9 people watched me sign for it. His offer came 4 days later, through his attorney, and it was $9,000. $9,000 for 15 years, and a paragraph explaining that this reflected my limited contribution to a business I had, in the language of the letter, been adjacent to. He called that night. He wanted to know if I'd read it. Then he said, in a voice I'd heard him use with vendors, that he hoped I would be reasonable about this. Reasonable. That was the word. I've thought about that word more than any other word in this entire story. My attorney had an office on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator. She was in her 60s, she took notes on legal pads with a fountain pen, and she did not smile at me once during the first meeting, which I came to understand was a kindness. I brought the bin. I brought all of it. She looked at the bin the way you look at a dog someone has brought into a restaurant. Then I put the transfer documents on her desk and told her what they were, and something in the room changed. She read them. She read them again, slower. She turned the pages back over and squared the stack and set it down, and then she took her glasses off, which I would learn was the worst sign there is. Tell me the year, she said. I told her. And the lawsuit. I told her about the supplier, and the certified letter, and the parking garage, and the driveway. She was quiet for a while. You understand how this reads? I said I didn't. It reads like the two of you moved assets to duck a creditor. There's a name for that. There's a whole body of law about it. A judge can look through a conveyance like this and put everything back where it started, and he can do it before lunch, and half of them enjoy it. I said the lawsuit settled. I said nobody was hurt. That helps. It doesn't fix it. Here's the part I need you to actually hear. She put her glasses back on. His side is going to stand up and say it was a sham, that neither of you ever intended you to own anything. And here's the ugly part, the part that keeps me from sleeping on cases like this. They'd be describing what happened. If you sit up there and say the transfer was real, you're saying you knowingly took title to shield him from a creditor. You'd be confessing to the same thing he did, on the record, under oath, and you'd be doing it alone, because he'll be sitting at the other table saying it was never real. The radiator ticked. Somebody's phone rang out in the hall. I asked what I actually had. She looked at the bin and then at me, and she did the thing I still respect her for, which is that she did not soften it. A house you live in, a job, and 14 years of receipts nobody's going to look at. Take the $9,000. And I drove home and sat on the stairs without taking my coat off. There's a specific kind of quiet that happens when a person whose whole personality is being prepared finds out that being prepared was not going to be enough. I sat in it for about 2 hours. I thought about the $9,000, and I did the math on what $9,000 is per year of a marriage, and the number is 600. And I want to tell you, I cried, but I didn't. I just sat there being a person who was very good at arithmetic and no good at anything else. At some point, I got cold and reached back and pulled the bin out from under the stairs, because it was there and my hand was there. I did not open it to find the transfer. I already knew what the transfer said. I had a warm copy of it from a jammed printer sitting in a folder labeled in pencil. I opened it because I wanted to look at the years, the way you go through photographs of a person after a funeral. And the first thing I picked up was a tax return, not from the transfer year, from the year after. I looked at it for a long moment before I understood what I was looking at. Then I set it on the step beside me and reached back into the bin and pulled the next year, and then the next. Every one of them put me down as the owner, not as a spouse, not as a signature on a joint return. As the owner, filed, signed, submitted, accepted. Year after year after year, all the way to the one we'd filed 14 months ago, which was sitting in that bin because I am the person in this marriage who puts things in the bin. I sat on those stairs with my coat on until 2 in the morning, and by the time I stood up, I had a stack on one side of me and a much smaller stack on the other, and the small stack was the one that mattered, and I already knew how I was going to spend the rest of that week. It wasn't the transfer. That's the thing I understood on those stairs, and it's the thing my attorney had not understood, because she'd been handed the transfer first, and everybody who is handed the transfer first looks at the transfer. It was never going to be the transfer. It was everything that came after it. I took 4 days off work and did what I am actually actually good at. I built a timeline, a real one, in a spreadsheet, the way I'd built 1,000 of them for clients who were about to get audited. Column A, date. Column B, document. Column C, what the document asserts. Column D, where the original is. I went year by year through 14 years of that bin, and it took me longer than 4 days, and I stopped sleeping normally somewhere around the second night. Here is what the timeline held by the end. 6 consecutive federal returns naming me as the owner of the business, each one signed by him under penalty of perjury as an officer of it. Every schedule that flowed out of those returns, allocating the company's income to me on paper, while the money went into a household he controlled. 4 separate loan applications, 2 commercial and 2 personal, in which he had listed the company under my ownership because the underwriting was better that way, and had signed each one attesting that the information was true and complete. 1 equipment lease with a personal guarantee that referenced my ownership in the second paragraph. A line of credit renewal, done twice, same thing. And then, in a folder from the year after the transfer, an email he had forwarded to me for a reason that had nothing to do with any of this, which is that he had wanted me to add an expense to the household ledger, and it happened to be the bottom message in a chain. The chain was between him and the accountant. I read it 4 times standing at the counter. Then I sat down and started looking for its brothers, and I found them, and there were 6 of them, 1 for every spring, because the accountant asked the same question every year at filing time, and my husband gave the same answer every year. And I had all 6 of them because he had a habit of forwarding chains without scrolling down, and I have a habit of filing things. They were not long emails. That's what got me. They were 2 lines. A man does not agonize over 2 lines. A man dashes off 2 lines while walking to a meeting and never thinks about them again for 6 years. I printed them. I printed everything. I put it in order, and I put it in a folder, and I did not tell anybody, not my sister, not my mother, because I had just spent an afternoon being told I had nothing, and I was not ready to be told it twice. I went back to the 4th floor with the broken elevator 8 days later. She had not expected to see me. I could tell by the pause before she said, "Come in." I did not say anything dramatic. I put the folder on her desk, and I said, "The transfer isn't the argument." She started reading. She got about a page and a half in, and then she stopped and pulled her legal pad over and started writing, which she had not done at all during our first meeting. 20 minutes went by. I sat there with my hands in my lap like a person at the doctor. Then she put the pen down and said a word I didn't know, which was ratification. I asked what it meant. It means the question in this case was never whether that transfer was honest when it was signed. That's the question they want. That's the question they've been building their entire file around. And honestly, it's the question I walked you into last time, and I'm going to apologize for that once, and then we're not going to discuss it again. She turned the folder around so I could see it. The question is what he did for the 6 years afterward. A man who signs a paper under pressure and then quietly waits for it to be undone is one thing. A man who signs a paper under pressure and then affirms it in writing to the federal government 6 separate times while taking a financial benefit from it every single year is something else. He didn't tolerate your ownership. He used it. He borrowed against it. He priced it. He instructed his own accountant to preserve it because it was saving him money. She tapped the top page. And he did all of that voluntarily years after the creditor was gone. There was no pressure left. The lawsuit was over. He kept it because he liked it. I asked her if it would be enough. She said she didn't know, which I appreciated more than a yes. Then she said we were going to subpoena the accountant and that it was going to get unpleasant and that I should prepare myself for the fact that a man who has told a story about himself for 6 years does not stop telling it just because someone shows him a document. She was right about that. She was right about all of it. The deposition was in a conference room with a view of a parking structure. His attorney was polished and slow and very good, and he spent the first 40 minutes asking me about my job in a tone of professional curiosity, the way you'd ask a person about a hobby. Then he asked me how many years I had done the company's books without being paid, and when I said 5, he wrote it down and let the silence sit. And then he asked whether it was fair to say that I had detailed knowledge of the company's financial structure. I said yes. Then he asked if it was fair to say I understood that structure better than my husband did. I understood then what the whole case was going to be. They were not going to argue that I hadn't helped. They were going to argue that I had helped too much, that I was the bookkeeper who had steered a distracted man into signing his life away and then sat on it for 6 years waiting, that the quiet was not patience but a plan, that the bin under the stairs was not a habit but a stockpile. He asked me, near the end, whether I had ever reminded my husband to reverse the transfer. I said twice. He asked whether I had put either reminder in writing. I said no. He wrote that down too, and he took his time doing it. Between the deposition and the hearing, there were 11 weeks. Here is an incomplete list of what happened in them. The $9,000 offer was withdrawn and replaced with nothing. 4 people I had considered friends called me to say they weren't taking sides, and then, in the same conversation, explained his position to me in his exact phrasing. My sister told me to settle. She said it kindly, and she said it more than once, and the last time she said it, she cried, and I understood that she was watching me spend money I didn't have on a thing she was sure I would lose. My mother did not tell me to settle. My mother, who had once said one sentence about my name being on something, called me every Sunday for 11 weeks and talked about absolutely nothing for an hour and never asked me how the case was going. I did not answer any of it. I got up at 5, I went to work, I came home, and I built the timeline out 1 more column, and I slept about 4 hours a night. He posted a photograph of a boat in there somewhere. I only know because someone showed me. Her deposition transcript came over on a Thursday. I had not intended to read all of it. My attorney sent it with a note saying there was nothing useful in it and that I should skip it if reading it would cost me anything. I read all of it anyway, at the kitchen table at 11 at night, which by then was simply simply where and when I existed. The first 60 pages were what you'd expect. She was poised. She had been coached well. She answered in short declarative sentences, and she did not volunteer anything. And twice she corrected my attorney's phrasing in a way that was meant to be heard. Then, near the end, they walked her through her employment history for the record. She stated her start date, she stated her title progression, and she was proud of it. And honestly, she should have been, because it was a real one. And then my attorney asked, in the flat tone of a woman closing out a line of routine background questions, whether she had ever held any professional licenses or certifications in connection with her employment. She said no. My attorney asked if she was certain. She said she had been at the front desk. She said she answered phones and scheduled conference rooms. She said, and this is on page 206, that she had never touched anything legal in her life. I sat at that table without moving for a while. Then I went to the bin. I pulled the folder from the transfer year, and I took out the warm stack that a jam printer had produced on a Tuesday afternoon 11 years earlier, and I turned to the bottom of page 1. There was a seal. There was a commission number. There was a signature in handwriting that was neater than anyone else's in that building. My attorney pulled the commission record the next morning. It had been issued the year before the transfer. It had been renewed twice since. It was, as of that week, active and in good standing, held under a name that had changed once, in the way names sometimes do, but attached to the same number it had always been attached to. I did not call anyone. I did not tell my sister. I did not allow myself to feel anything about it for 11 days, because I had already been wrong once about what I had, and I had learned my lesson about hope in a room with a broken elevator. I put the timeline in order. I put the returns behind it, and the loan applications behind those, and the 6 emails behind those, and page 1 of the transfer at the very back where it belonged, because it was never the argument. It was only the thing they'd trip over on the way to it. Then I put the whole thing in an envelope and sealed it myself. The morning of the hearing was clear and cold, and I got there 50 minutes early because I have never once in my life been late to anything. He arrived at 9:20 in a suit that cost more than my first car. I know what it cost because I had spent 4 days of my life inside his expense records. He looked well. He looked like a man who had been sleeping. He came over before we were called. He did not have to. That's the part I keep. He crossed an entire courtroom to lean down toward the table where I was sitting with a woman in her 60s and a banker's box, and he said, close enough that only I could hear him, that I should have taken the offer when it was still on the table, and that I was about to find out what the last 15 years had actually been worth. Then he said, and I am quoting him exactly, "You'll never touch my money again." He walked back to his side of the room and buttoned his jacket. She was 2 rows behind him in the gallery, legs crossed, phone face down on her knee. She had done her hair the way you do it for something. When the bailiff called us to rise, she leaned toward the rail and said something to him, not quietly enough, the way people talk when they've decided a room belongs to them. She said, I didn't deserve a single dime of it. 2 rows is not far enough away to whisper. The clerk heard her. The bailiff heard her. My attorney did not look up from her legal pad, but her pen stopped. The judge came in. He was maybe 60, unhurried, with the affect of a man who has heard every version of every story and is not going to be entertained by yours. His attorney went first, and he was good. He spoke for 11 minutes, and he never once raised his voice. He talked about vision. He talked about risk. He talked about a man who built something from nothing while other people watched. He said I had been supportive. He used that word 4 separate times, and each time he used it the way you leave a tip. He closed by getting out ahead of us, which is what you do when you know exactly what's in the other side's file. He told the court that the respondent would be presenting an instrument from 11 years ago that transferred certain interests into my name, and that the court should understand its context. A defensive measure, executed under the pressure of litigation, never intended by either party to convey beneficial ownership of anything. A shell, he said. A shell that my client's spouse has spent 11 years waiting to cash. He sat down. He was pleased. He had every reason to be. The judge turned to our table. My attorney stood, and she did not argue any of it. She did not say the word sham, and she did not say the word shell. She walked to the clerk and handed up a sealed envelope, and said only that it had been prepared by her client, that everything in it had been produced in discovery, and that she would rest on the record as submitted. The judge opened it. I watched him read page 1, and I watched his eyebrows go up about a 1/4 inch, and I watched his attorney rise before the page had even finished turning. Your Honor, that instrument is exactly what I described. It was executed under duress of litigation. It was never intended to convey anything. I'm aware of what page 1 is, the judge said without looking up. Sit down. The second page was not about the transfer at all. It was a timeline. Dates down the left. Every instrument, what it asserted, and where the original was sitting, which in every single case was a plastic bin under a set of stairs in a house he had not slept in since March. 6 federal returns naming me as the owner of that company, each one executed by him as an officer under penalty of perjury, in 6 consecutive springs after the creditor was gone. 4 loan applications in which he had presented my ownership to a bank because the underwriting priced better on that side of the ledger, and had put his signature under a line attesting it was all true. An equipment lease, a line of credit, renewed twice, and 6 emails, 2 lines apiece, 1 every spring, from him to the accountant. Leave it in her name. It's cleaner. It saves me. He hadn't forgotten to reverse it. That was the whole thing, right there. And it took 11 years and a woman with a bin to say it in 1 sentence. He had not forgotten. He had kept it on purpose every year because it made him money. And then he had written that down and sent it to a professional who filed it. The judge read the 2nd page slowly. Then he read the 3rd, which was the returns, and the 4th, which was the loan applications. And he stopped and went back up a page twice. The room got very quiet. Not respectful quiet. The other kind. Counsel, the judge said. You told me a moment ago that this instrument was never intended to convey anything. anything. That's correct, Your Honor. Then explain to me the tax returns. His attorney said he would need a moment with the exhibit. Take one, the judge said. And then, without waiting, while you're taking it, explain the loan applications as well. Because a shell doesn't get pledged to a lender. A shell doesn't get priced into a rate. I did not look over. I want to say I did, because it would make a better story. But I kept my eyes on the table in front of me and I listened. And the sound of a man's confidence leaving a room is not silence. It's a chair. It's a very small adjustment in a chair, made twice by someone who has run out of positions. The judge got to the emails last. He read the first one, he read the second one, then he set the page down flat, took his glasses off, and laughed. It was not a big laugh. That's what I want people to understand, because everyone assumes it was cruel, and it wasn't. It was one short exhale from someone who had sat on that bench a long time, and it had the quality of relief in it, like something had finally arrived that he'd been waiting his whole career to be handed. Oh, he said to nobody. This is good. He put his glasses back on. Sir, he said to my husband, did you write these? His attorney started to stand. The judge did not look at him. I'd like to hear it from him. There was a pause that went on for a while. Yes, my husband said. Every spring, for 6 years. Yes. After the underlying litigation had resolved. Yes. So there was no creditor to shield from, and you instructed your accountant, in writing, to preserve an ownership structure you are today describing to me as fictional, because, and here he looked back down at the page and read the last 3 words out in the flattest voice I have ever heard a sentence read in. It saves me. Nobody said anything. Then the judge turned back to page 1, and I knew what he was doing before he did it, because I had been looking at the bottom of that page for 11 days. There's a notarial certificate on the first instrument, he said. Seal, signature, commission number. That number is current. It's been renewed twice. He looked up over his glasses at the gallery. Is the holder of that commission present in this courtroom? Nothing happened for about 3 seconds. Then my attorney slid a single sheet across to the clerk, which was page 206 of a deposition transcript, and said, for the record, that the witness had testified under oath that she had never held a professional license, and had never, in her words, touched anything legal in her life. The judge read it. He looked at the gallery again. Ma'am, he said, second row, please stand. She stood up slowly, and it was the first time all morning she'd moved like a person, and not like a photograph of one. She was still holding the phone. The screen was face down against her palm. The judge held page 1 up. Is that your seal? She looked at my husband. She looked at him for a long time, longer than she should have, long enough that everyone in that room watched her do it, and he did not turn around. He sat facing forward with both hands flat on the table like a man waiting for an elevator. Yes, she said. He turned around then. He turned around to find her, and she was already moving, purse against her chest, up the aisle, past the rail, not looking at him, and not looking at me, and not looking at the judge, and the door at the back made the sound those doors make, which is nothing at all. The judge set the paper down and squared the edges. Anything further from either side? My attorney said no. And the man who had crossed a courtroom that morning to tell me what 15 years had been worth sat very still in his expensive suit, in front of a bench holding 6 of his own emails and 11 years of his own signature, and said the only true thing he'd said to me all year. No.